Good evening, Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs of Greenland, Mrs. Vivian Motzfield. Welcome. Honored to have you here with us. Honorable distinguished member of the Italian Foreign Ministry and Parliament, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, welcome all to this interesting roundtable titled Greenland and Scenarios for Arctic Security, organized by the Guarini Institute of Public Affairs. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has certainly pierced what Thomas Schelling in his book, The Strategy of Conflict, defines as saliency. Saliency deals with lines and thresholds that all parties agree are of paramount importance and that once breached, leave space for massive change. The Russian invasion of Ukraine did just that, and the situation has changed dramatically at the international level. The international system, as shown also by the events of the Middle East of the past 3 years and the very recent one, has become much more violent and dangerous. There has been a geostrategic reset, which is raising unprecedented questions. One aspect of this reset is a complete reevaluation by the West of its strategic posture, whether by reconsidering NATO or the security importance of the Arctic area and Greenland. As surprising and unsettling the recent interest of the US administration to obtain control of Greenland through a deal or by force might be, once we move away from a Mercatorian view of the world and start looking at the globe from the North Pole, we see that 3 continents sit at a round table called the Arctic Polar Circle, an incredibly close table at the top of the world. This has acquired a new, unexpected role in geopolitical affairs. And it is to an analysis of these important aspects that we are lucky to participate today with an outstanding group of experts whom I thank on behalf of JCU for being with us. I also want to thank the Guarini Institute for organizing this meeting. And I would like to give the floor now to our moderator, Dr. Doa Abdel Motal, for an introduction of our panelists. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this event. I'd like to welcome you all, and I'd like to start by welcoming Madam Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Greenland, for your presence and for your interest in this event. It's an honor for us to have you here. I'd like to welcome also our very distinguished panelists, who I will introduce in a minute. I am Doa Abdel Motal. I'm visiting professor of polar studies at Sciences Po in Paris. My connection to John Cabot is very strong. I'm one of the advisors to the Guarini Institute. I can't see the the director of the institute, Federico Argentieri, of course, is here. Thank you, Federico, for this initiative and for this event. John Cabot plays a very important role in Rome. It's an American liberal arts university right at the heart of this important city, and the Guarini Institute is a think tank right in the center of Rome, connecting Italy to global events. And it is therefore very significant that we hold this event here. Also, as you know, this event is being held as a prelude to a very big conference that is about to start tomorrow in Rome, the Arctic Circle Forum, which has been brought to Italy by the Ministry of Defense of Italy that has wanted this event to be held here. Italy is a near-Arctic state. It's an observer to the Arctic Council and plays a significant role in the Arctic. It also has a research base in Svalbard. This is a prelude to an absolutely fascinating set of conversations that will start tomorrow. Today's conversation is just as important because the Arctic is no longer a peripheral region in global affairs. It used to be that the Arctic and the Antarctic were the 2 ends of our planet that nobody needed to pay attention to other than those who were very super close to them. It is no longer the case. You will have heard about Greenland in the news very often recently, but you will have also heard how strategic competition and great power competition is playing out up in the Arctic. We're hearing less about the Antarctic. The Antarctic is one of my areas of expertise, but I think we should be putting the Antarctic on our radar screen as well, because there are a lot of things happening in the Antarctic as we speak. They are just not at the center of attention as much as the Arctic at the moment. The war in Ukraine has redefined the Arctic. The Arctic was considered a zone of low tension until that war happened, and governance structures of the Arctic were shaken. The Arctic Council was suspended. It was supposed to operate under the Russian chairmanship when the war broke out, but the Arctic 7 no longer wanted to meet with the Arctic's 8th nation. And Russia, of course, is not just a number in the Arctic, it is half of the Arctic, as one of my colleagues from the high north likes to say. So Arctic governance was shaken to its core as a result of the Ukraine war. The Arctic Council, its work has resumed under the very able chairmanship of Norway and then Denmark. But the cooperation with Russia is not at its peak, to put it mildly. So the Arctic is one of the regions that has been really affected by the war, and we now know, of course, that NATO has expanded with a major impact on the Arctic because Sweden and Finland, Arctic nations, are now part of NATO. So we have a NATO versus Russia Arctic at the moment. Greenland has moved to the center of global attention for a number of reasons. Overtures by the United States about Greenland recently have dominated the news. Greenland is very strategic, in the minds of many, very strategic real estate in the Arctic. It's a massive island in the Arctic Ocean, but it has resources, and it is said that who dominates Greenland can also dominate space. But we must not forget that the Arctic has people, that Greenland has people, and that indigenous people deserve their say, deserve to be heard, and deserve to be at the table. And they are indeed with us here today, and we really look forward to hearing from them. Are we on the verge of a new Arctic order? And this is what I hope we will delve into in this conference today. So let me, without further ado, introduce our very distinguished panel to you. Lassi Heininen. Welcome, Lassi. Lassi is one of the leading scholars of Arctic politics and security, a recognized expert of geopolitics in the High North. He's the founder of the Global Arctic Initiative, which has become an important international platform shaping discussions on Arctic governance and transformation. Giuliana Panieri, welcome, Giuliana, is director of the Institute of Polar Sciences of the Italian National Research Council, known here as the CNR, and professor at the Arctic University of Norway. She's lived in the north for many years, and of course, it suffices to Google her name to see her research footprint. And everything she's done in the Arctic. Sara Olsvig. Hello, Sara. Sara Olsvig is the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council and a major political figure in Greenland. She previously served as leader of one of Greenland's most important political parties and brings direct experience from the highest levels of Arctic political life. Leonardo Parigi is not yet with us, but he will be joining us. Today is another day that has been packed with events before the conference that starts tomorrow. I believe he's with a minister at the moment and will be coming. I will simply say that he's the founder and director of Osservatorio Artico, which has become a key Italian platform for analysis of Arctic developments. He will be with us shortly. So without further ado, I will start putting questions to the panelists, but in the end, what we want is a discussion with you, the audience. Please feel free to either respond from where you're sitting or to come to the podium if you wish. Lassi, I'd like to start with you. Given the breakdown and partial paralysis of Arctic governance since 2022, are we witnessing temporary disruption, in your view, or the end of the cooperative Arctic model that we knew?
Thank you, Joa. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for inviting me. Your question is, I would say, very, very timely and relevant. As an old school political scientist with critical approach, I wouldn't be ready to admit that there is some new Arctic order. And I'm not ready to adopt that kind of understanding that the Arctic model, which was created about 30 years ago, that it is totally gone. And one reason is that that model has passed several tests. I would like to remind you when Russia did the expedition to the bottom of the North Pole, 2007. There were some ones from other Arctic states who were not so pleased with that fact, although Russia followed the playbook by UNCLOS. And then we saw Crimea, 2014. And then again that, no, Arctic cooperation will collapse very soon. No. And then 2022, the full-scale attack of Russia to Ukraine. There was a pause, yes, but however, the work of the Arctic Council and its working groups have continued. So it has been rather resilient. And of course, I mean, this is something to think about very carefully and critically. That is that real? Is that resilience real or not? But I mean, to me, I would say that like politics or geopolitics is not determined. Anarchy is how states make it. So there are always alternative ways to do things. So even there is this kind of pressure that the world order is in disorder. Like I think the world is simply in disorder now. It doesn't mean that you will lose all the structures. And it doesn't mean that there is only great power rivalry based on might means rights, which is going on. Like if you follow media, it is easily your understanding. There is also save the planet kind of discourse, that we are in a real trouble because of climate change. So that we have to cooperate. And there are many, many actors in world politics who are ready to cooperate and who do many efforts in order to keep the cooperation going on. And I would say that Greenland is in the middle of these realities. And Arctic is some kind of microcosmos, or test ground, if you wish, for the Arctic states in the first place, but also for the Northern Hemisphere and the world. So the Arctic model, what I mentioned, where you have the 8 Arctic states and Arctic indigenous peoples, was constructed by Arctic states. It was something what they wanted to make it, because they thought that the conflict or the rivalry of the Cold War was not good, so that we should try something else. So if that was a geopolitical decision in a way, so that was exactly one example that anarchy is how states make it. They wanted to have that. But there are certain reasons why it has been so resilient. And on the one hand, there are common interests. Think about the first reason why Arctic cooperation started, long-range pollution. The Arctic Ocean started to become a sink of pollutants from the low latitudes. And then, like today, search and rescue. There's more and more traffic in Arctic's waters, so you need search and rescue. It's a duty of the littoral states of the Arctic Ocean to do that together if needed, and they do that together if needed. But then there are certain special features of the Arctic geopolitics, Arctic security, and I would mention two here. One is the original nature of the heavy military structures in the Arctic. So the Arctic has been militarized for decades, and that is for the global deterrence. The nuclear weapon systems of the USA and the nuclear weapon systems of Russia are for global deterrence. And that's why there is a balance. I mean, we lost the last arms control treaty, that's true. But still, however, these major nuclear powers would like to keep the balance. So these deployed nuclear weapons are there for global deterrence. They are not for the region. The targets are outside the region. And then there is a high level of international legal legacy, stability there, because you have UNCLOS and you have other international treaties, and all the parties, they would like to keep them functioning. So, let's have patience with geopolitics, and let's have patience to build threat pictures. It's so easy, it's too easy to build threat pictures. Soon they will come enemy pictures, and then they will come enemies, and then boom, like we saw 2 days ago in Iran. And let's concentrate on real issues like how the global resource-based economy with political and economic cultures of endless use of resources impacts the Arctic. Because the Arctic is already integrated into global economy. So this is the big issue there. More utilization of resources there. And then the Arctic states, they don't have real political ability to make effective managing systems to control that. You don't have any strict environmental regulations how to use resources in the Arctic, although you could have them today or tomorrow, if the Arctic states would like to, but they don't. And so this is the most important issue there. And I'm so surprised so often by media and even my colleagues, why to speculate with wars, armed conflicts in the Arctic when you have not had any armed conflicts or wars in the Arctic since the end of the Second World War. But you have those in Middle East, in Africa, in Central Asia, in Europe. So let's concentrate on the real issues and try to keep this as a model where you can still keep this kind of stability and trust based on cooperation, which is, of course, you need time. But however, the ground is still solid there.
Thank you very much, Lassi. Some very thought-provoking and thoughtful comments there about how our narratives can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, how we need to be careful against, we need to be careful in generating an image of the Arctic of conflict. and of great power rivalry, because that could very well materialize as a result of that narrative and not because it's preordained. Sara, let me turn to you. Greenland and indigenous governance sit at the intersection of security, sovereignty, and self-determination. How can Arctic security debates avoid sidelining indigenous political agency in this emerging environment?
Thank you so much. I hope my voice will last throughout these couple of hours. I have a bit of a cough. Excellencies, Minister, Excellencies, it's good to be here at this magnificent university in the very nice city of Rome. I enjoy visiting. This is my second time here, and it's growing on me, I have to admit. A bit confusing city, but it is growing on me. It's very romantic. Thank you for the question, and I think actually that we have to turn it around a little bit in answering it. Firstly, because indigenous peoples of the Arctic have always asserted self-determination. Indigenous peoples have been governing the Arctic for time immemorial, for thousands of years. It is only within the last centuries that the Arctic now looks different, that there are lines on the map making up the state borders, that there are ways of governing that loses its holistic perspective, that loses its sight on the ecosystems, on our ability to live as part of nature, from the nature, as peoples of the Arctic. And I think that perspective is extremely important to remember when we talk about Arctic governance today, because it also explains from a different perspective exactly what Lassi was explaining, why the Arctic as a governance structure is different from so many other governance structures. Asserting self-government and self-determination is exactly also the difference between the governance structure of the Arctic today compared to when, for example, the Cold War started. Much of the recognition of the right of self-determination now established by law, recognized in international law, it does not exist in some kind of an internationally legal void, as some sometimes claim in terms of Greenland, where I'm from. It is actually there, and it's built, it is lived through our own governments. One very clear example being our Minister of Foreign Affairs from Greenland here in the room today. Who had ever imagined that an Inuk woman would travel to Washington, D.C. and deliver the very clear message to the world's greatest military power? Who had ever imagined that we would have a governance system in the Arctic that is not only formed by the states, but formed by the nations and peoples of the land? That is how our governance system is formed in the Arctic. And that is why we cannot only think in states when we talk about the Arctic. So today, the Arctic Council is led by the Kingdom of Denmark, with a minister as the chair, a minister who is indigenous, leading a public government in the nation of Nunaat, with the Arctic ambassador, who is also a Greenlandic person, an Inuk person, leading the senior Arctic officials. And this is actually in a time where many would have guessed that power would be moving south again. To me, that is a very clear example that we cannot think Arctic governance in the way we used to. If we think about just the last 3, 4, 5 decades, how we think Arctic governance has to be now changed in the sense that our self-determination as peoples of the Arctic is inevitable, in the sense that decisions taken by the people of Greenland, decisions taken by the people of Nunavut, the decisions taken by Inupiat in the Arctic slope, or any other people who live across the Arctic, is now forming defense policies, foreign policies, security policies of the states. And it is forming those policies first and foremost simply because we live there. We live and breathe there, we develop our societies, but also because to a very large extent, the Arctic states have recognized our right of self-determination. So in the last months, we have seen the rupture, as it's been called, the changing world order, and I to a large extent agree with Lassi on what is said. But it also is also a reality that we are up against, because the changing world order comes with the pressure of those non-Arctic entities and states who do not necessarily understand Arctic governance the Arctic governance that I have just explained, who might only see Denmark when they see the territory that includes Greenland, who might not see the self-governing entities and nations when they look at Canada, who might not fully understand the power and self-governance of Inupiat and Yupik and other indigenous peoples of Alaska, or even the peoples of Chukotka. So this is really a challenge to the way we think, also when we talk about a changing world order, geopolitics becoming the first thing we talk about when we walk into the room, despite climate change continuing to be the most immediate and biggest threat to us as peoples of the Arctic. It really challenges the way that we institutionally think and the way that we teach at our universities at large. So we are indeed in a time of changes, but it's also a time of changes that we can take and come out in the other end stronger. And I think that is really the task that is ahead of us, to not fall into the pits of how we usually think, how we usually conceive of power, how we usually conceive of geopolitics, and really step into a new path where we fully recognize, especially the exceptionalism, I want to say, of the Arctic, because it is there and it hasn't ceased to be there. Yes, it is probably disrupted, but it hasn't ceased to be there. So how will it look when we come out the other end, in the other side of all that is going on? And I agree that the Arctic Council is really a good example. I do not agree that the Arctic Council is no longer relevant or is simply not able to function, because we as indigenous peoples organizations that are permanent participants, together with the states, are working. We are doing the work of the Arctic Council. And again, here we see how indigenous peoples can do things that states cannot. Because who is it that meet in person or online still today with the whole circumpolar participation? That is us, the permanent participants, with the chairship of the Arctic Council. We've just had our second meeting with the Kingdom of Denmark's chairship after having had 4 or 5 of those meetings during the Norwegian chairship, where we as indigenous peoples actually do gather, all of us, including the Russian indigenous peoples, to discuss and strategize on how to continue the work of the Arctic Council. So there are ways of working that we live, that might not be portrayed in our mainstream way of analyzing Arctic governance, and especially not in mainstream media. And to fully understand where that comes from, you have to look back in time. You have to look back to prior to the establishment of states, or even to the 70s, where indigenous peoples already in 1973 met for the first time around a round table, a literally round table, calling for circumpolar cooperation to be established. And that was long before the 1987 Gorbachev speech. So indigenous peoples were paving the way.
Let me move over to you. First of all, thank you for making the time to be with us today, because you have a big conference on your hands as of tomorrow. So, and I'm sure there are thousands of people who want to meet you at the moment. Juliana, scientific cooperation has historically been the backbone of Arctic stability. Can science remain insulated from geopolitical fracture? And are we entering an era where even research will become securitized? over to you.
Thanks a lot for the question, and first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me. Of course, I wanted to take the time to come, and thanks to the President and Excellencies. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. And here, okay. So regarding the question that you asked at Doha, which is not an easy one, but I wanted to say, and I'm talking from, is the scientist now talking. I mean, science has worked quite well until now in the Arctic, and for the last decades, science has been the language that everyone, let's say, have used. And science, I want to say, that has functioned as a stabilizing force in the Arctic. And even during geopolitical tensions, one example is the Cold War, science has continued to collaborate. So scientists were discussing, meeting, and there was a particular event that happened during the Cold War that was the International Geophysical Year, and where we had US and Russia together with 60 countries sitting at the same table, around the same table, discussing about science. So science has been the language until now. But we have to be realistic today. And science does not operate in isolated political framework. So scientists are affected by the, let's say, decision that the government take. And because government decide, for example, funding, decide research, how to put the money for research infrastructures, can sign agreement, release visa. So, of course, we are affected by what is going on today. And it is true, and I like very much the fact that the Arctic Council is still operating, and all the countries participate in meetings. And I'd like to remind everyone that Italy is an observer since 2013, if I'm not mistaken. So this is really nice because it gives us the possibility really to listen what is going on and to participate in the discussion and to bring back what it is discussed. But then, as I said, when geopolitical tensions rises, so then everyone and everything is a little bit under pressure. So the question is if science will become or will stay neutral from the situation that we are facing today. And I don't know which is the answer. We really hope, because as it has been mentioned, biochemical processes, our planet, climate change, sea level rise, extreme events, they don't follow borders. They are just involving everything, everyone. And so what I see as a scientist today are two, I would say, risky situations. The first one is that different groups of scientists from different countries, they work on a specific topic and they don't share information, they don't share data, meaning that not that we waste, but we spend the double of the money to do similar things. And we shouldn't do this, because we know that to understand better what is going on and to understand which will be the consequences of climate change, we need to do this together. And so we need to have a multidisciplinary project, we need to bring different culture, we need to bring in the local knowledge, because locals and the indigenous people have lived, and I'm thinking about the Arctic, of course, have lived there for many, many years. So they have the knowledge. So we started maybe in 1947 to record temperature increase. So we rely on sensor and instrument, but very, very recently. So then to go back in time, we need to ask, we need to involve who was living there before. The other, let's say, risk is that everything, it's taking this dimension of security, only, I would say, military security. But then we need to keep in mind that security in the Arctic is not only military security, it's not only defense, it is also climate security, food security, health. So there are many processes, and who works in geosciences, and not only, of course, know that one event, one extreme event, for example, has profound consequences on biodiversity, on temperature rise, on flooding, and so on. So the planet is connected, it is interconnected. So everything needs to be seen really on an holistic way right now. And what I think, we should not go towards the path of this fragmented science, so everyone is doing its own, let's say, program, business, without really involving who lives there, who has worked there. And then we need to think that we need to share. We really need to use, I like very much this, because very often what you have said at the beginning, because the narrative is very important. So the Arctic has become, let's say, the territory where there is a lot of geopolitical tension and a lot of interest and so on. But I like very much the idea to keep the Arctic as a great example, because it has worked quite well until now and still work to some extent. But we should really, and I'm talking now, I put something a little bit personal, and I have led an expedition in the Arctic in November. And until a few years ago, it was not an issue to have scientists from all over the world, because when you build up your team, you bring the expert, right, to understand and to answer the scientific question that you have. And it will be very bad if we will not be able to invite the best scientists that we want to have on board, because we cannot, because there are some tensions that we cannot face. So scientists should really be beyond all this, because the planet belongs to everyone. So if we want to protect it, we really need to have the freedom of really involving the best people that we think should answer or should help us to answer the scientific questions that we have. So what I think it might be, I don't have, of course, solutions, but I think that there are a few things on which we should invest our effort and also our funding, which is keeping the long-term observing system. There are several in the Arctic, and some are instruments, but others are, of course, the local knowledge that is there, that we need to listen, we need to bring on board from the beginning of our project, not inviting our colleagues because we have to invite them, but we need to have them from the start to plan what we want to do, which I think I understand that might be some limitation, but this data transparency, but mostly data interoperability. So the data that we collect should be open. Maybe not everything can be open from the beginning, but then have at least this mentality of really keep open what we do. Because if we don't have open data, if we don't share, then we risk to have some misunderstanding, also when it comes to environmental protection or actions that we should or we should not do. And when there is no clear data, when there is no clear knowledge, then we risk to plan something that is wrong. And when things are not transparent and crystal clear, then this will increase uncertainty at different level. And we should not go in that path, in my opinion. So there are a few things on which we should really invest. And one is multilateral scientific platform, involving everyone and all the knowledge, and not only Arctic states, but also non-Arctic, because what is happening in the Arctic is affecting the rest of the planet, is affecting everyone. Arctic and Antarctica are the main regulators of our climate. So what is happening in the Mediterranean Sea, because, I mean, we are in the Mediterranean here, I mean, is affected by what happened in the Arctic and in Antarctica. And if we are reading the last publications or the last reports from different agencies, we see that the situation might change very, very quickly. And so I'm not sure we are ready for it, but so we should really put some effort in collaborating and cooperating.
Thank you very much, Juliana. Some excellent comments as well. What catches my attention in what you've just said is that science has been a language in the Arctic. So I think that's a very powerful statement right there. Science is not just an activity in the Arctic, it's a language. It binds the Arctic, it keeps Arctic states together. I think your point about the importance of sharing science is very clear, and you're absolutely right. And you've spoken about the need to redefine security in the Arctic. Security isn't just about weapons and an arms race and satellites and other things. Security is also about climate change. It's also about food security. There are other types of security issues that we need to think about. Thank you for mentioning interoperability, which is a really big deal, whether in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, or in outer space. The interoperability of our scientific equipment is a very important issue. And non-Arctic states. So, and I'm sure there will be questions in this room about the non-Arctic states. And in fact, the Arctic Circle Forum, the conference that starts tomorrow, will start in a non-Arctic state. And some non-Arctic states define themselves as near-Arctic states. So there is also a discussion around what is an Arctic state and who is near to the Arctic and who's not, and what are the stakes. So some very powerful comments right there. Let me immediately open the floor for questions. I'm sure there'll be many questions. Please tell us who you are and who your question is directed to when you ask for the mic. Okay.
Hello. This question is for Dr. Olsvig. I'm Daniele Giomini, a political science student here at John Cabot in my first year. My question is, of course we all know that President Donald Trump has recently made several statements and has floated the idea of an annexation of Greenland, whether through military or political means. This is not the first time he makes such a statement. This has happened during the first Trump administration too. And so my question is, do you think that this administration will mark the definitive break between US and Greenland in terms of military and political partnership? Or do you think that this is simply a break in relationships that is bound to this administration and that will then heal and resume after this administration completes its term?
How long time do I have? No, thank you so much for this question. No, I don't think that what we're seeing right now will mean an end to cooperation between Galashinet, Greenland, and the US. And I think that we have to see that situation in a bit of a broader perspective. I think that the change to the world order that is being expressed through the current US administration has been coming for a while. We have, from the Inuit Circumpolare Council, when we travel to the UN to different negotiations over the past 3-4 years, seen changes among many states. We've seen many states backing down from championing human rights. We've seen states backing off now from supporting and recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples. We've seen states backing off from being ambitious on climate policies. And this is not just one state. So those changes that we've seen coming now materialize in this very concrete example, which is the interest expressed towards our nation, Galashinet Greenland, making Galashinet Greenland a symbol of those changes. Making also more and more states and nations and indigenous peoples voice where they stand. Let's stay with the term rupture on each side of those ruptures. And I think that what we've seen in the past 2 months have really shown a strength among the middle powers, the small powers, indigenous peoples, everyone who share the values of upholding international law, upholding a world order that recognizes peoples as equal to all peoples, including indigenous peoples, and recognizes that we are not ready to give up what we spent decades building in terms of multilateral institutions and frameworks. And so I think that none of us really know exactly what's going to happen next. There's a multiplicity of scenarios. But it does put us in a place that requires of us to be very clear. If we are the people of the government of Galashinat, if we are Italy, if we are EU, if we are a Nordic country, if we are Canada, everybody have been required to be much clearer on our stances. And I think ultimately that's a positive thing, because we have seen very, very clearly one after the other expressing where they stand and that they stand on those values. So I fully recognize that we are dealing with the most powerful military power in this situation. And I also recognize, and it's so in my own family, the elder and the younger generations are very concerned. My concern personally is broader than Greenland itself. It is towards the bigger development and the risk of losing what the world society spent so much energy and so much capacity in terms of also intelligence, I mean this kind of intelligence, in building what was built after the Second World War. And I do think that there are many, many, many individuals, institutions, politicians, and so forth, also within the US, who recognize that. And so it's difficult to say again what's going to happen next, but we have, and when I say we from Galashinat, but also from the Inuit Circumpolare Council, have clearly rejected what has been said. And what we have said from this Inuit Circumpolare Council is that there's simply no such thing as a better colonizer. So we've put this into the perspective of a longer history of interests in the lands and resources of Arctic indigenous peoples, because that's actually what's going on and being repeated.
Thank you, Sara. In fact, Sara has written a well-known piece that is called "There is no such thing as a better colonizer." That is quite a well-known piece and widely read, of course. Other questions? Yes, please.
Hello, thank you for coming. My name is Katerina. I'm a master's student and I'm half Finnish origin. We have Sami origins in the family, and half Italian. So hyvää iltaa. That means good evening for those that don't speak Finnish. So my question is for Professor Heininen. And so we've seen tonight that the Arctic is actually a story of hope that uses the language of science to communicate in this world. And somehow the Arctic has always been a little bit of a mystery to everyone. Also, when I was a kid in Finland, it was seen as the secret area where Santa Claus would live. So it's something that we've grown up to not really look at in this way. It was kind of like a zone where you wouldn't go or think about in a way. So given this, that it's a bit of a new area, how can we think that we can implement policies, for example, in countries that are not countries that are so close up north, for example, so countries like Italy? How can Italy implement policies that support the Arctic and promote the independence of the indigenous people and of the wildlife and so on? Thank you.
Hyvää iltaa. Kiitoksia kysymyksestä. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think that Italy, like we heard, Italy is one of the observer states of the Arctic Council, can do a lot, like other observer states. And science, as has been mentioned here today, is absolutely very, very crucial field. And I can only add there that there is something called freedom of science, which is very, very, very important, particularly now. And most important thing there is to implement it, not only say that in speeches, but to implement it when it is needed. And now it's the moment. It's a perfect storm for that. And I have struggled with that the last 4 years. We have to be able and right to do our job. That simple as that. And there I think that Italy, other observer states of the Arctic Council can do a lot. Please support us. I have analyzed the Arctic policies and strategies of all, not only the Arctic states, but also the observer states, including Italy, by the way. And of course, science is their number one, what they are doing in the Arctic. It's totally understandable. And I know that some representatives of observer states are thinking that it's so little what we can do. Our task is to observe. Yeah, that's very true. But it matters how you do that. It's a lot, actually, if you don't do it really carefully and with respect. The indigenous peoples and other people of the Arctic. And there is one more thing, which is not mentioned that often or even thought. I'm not sure even the observer states if they are really thinking about that. Okay, you have been welcome to come and observe us. You have applied that and you have been accepted because there are some criteria. You have fulfilled the criteria. And you are welcome to the meetings. And in the meetings, you are not allowed to speak, but you can use the coffee breaks, tea breaks, and you can be active there if you wish. And I have been involved in these meetings, and I can say that it is very efficient if you really are not only drinking coffee or tea, but using them. But then, okay, then there is this one thing. And that one thing is that you do not have that one burden what the Arctic states have. Because you don't have state sovereignty there in the Arctic. I mean, how often that is the problem for the Arctic states not to do, for example, like I mentioned, not to have the strict environmental regulations. Because there is national security and all interests of economic interest of the state, etc., etc. And then there is state sovereignty. And unlike observer states, they can concentrate on the real issue, to do research there, and concentrate on environmental protection and climate change mitigation. And I mean, these are real tasks. I would say these are really huge tasks. And there you have local, global coming together. And the Arctic is exactly this kind of, you said a little bit mysterious region in your childhood. Yeah, it's still a little bit, because one thing is that it's very global. But at the same time, it's very local. And when you go there and experience it, then you see that you have the both elements there present. And so that's why, I mean, for the observer state, I would say that yes, they can do much, much more. Most probably they are doing their best, but still they can do it a little bit better.
Thank you, Lassi. I'd like to ask you, Giuliana, to comment on the same question, the role of Italy in the Arctic, in particular on the eve of this very big conference that Italy has decided to host here.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm very happy to follow up a little bit and to say a couple of words about what Italy is doing. Well, first of all, as it has been said, Italy is an observer in the Arctic Council. And then the Arctic Council function in this way. There is the Council, of course, with the Arctic state, and then there are several working groups underneath. One working group is on pollution, another one is on biodiversity, another one is on wildfires, and so on. And then in each of these working groups, Italy is represented. And so scientists from the Institute of Polar Science, from CNR, and also other university or other research institute, Italian research institute. So the contribution that we give is through science. And so there are monthly meetings, and then the scientists sit and discuss about program and project to do together and environmental issues, for example. So this is, for example, the contribution that Italy is giving. I wanted to say that Italy has been in the Arctic since the 1400s. And the first explorer that he didn't reach the Arctic itself, the Arctic, but I mean, he was very close, was Giovanni Cabot. He was from Genova, sailing and from Venice. So let's say that Italy has been there for a few centuries now. And Italy has been permanently present in the Arctic since I think it's 1979 in Greenland with an observatory, which is Thule Observatory, some colleague from INGV. And then the National Research Council has a research base in Ny-Ålesund research station. So let's say that Italy has been there for many, many years, collecting data, contributing to Arctic science. And this is easily seen if you look at the example at the publications that have been published on Arctic science. Regarding the conference, well, and here I say something from a professor working in Norway. I think it is fantastic to see the Arctic coming so far south. And I have to say that I'm very proud that it is in Rome, and that Rome has been chosen, and also, and mostly, the CNR, the National Research Council, which is the biggest research performing organization in Italy. Of course, there are other institutes and universities, but this is a very important sign. This is a symbol, it's a symbol of science, so meaning that the science has to be at the base of this discussion, of this discourse, because if the environment is not understood, if it's not clear, if we don't have enough data, means that we don't care. We don't care about something that we don't know. And the Arctic, I can tell you, as a marine geoscientist, that we know where it is, geographically speaking, of course, we have been there, but the data that we have are data that are collected in, I don't know, 1 month span. So most of the Arctic is unknown, and we cannot protect it if we don't know it. So 20% of the species in the Arctic, marine species, is known and described. So there is really a lot to do, and at the same time, this is a place that is strongly affected by climate change. Is warming up much faster than the rest of the planet, and I think that the contribution of Italy is on science, and we hope we contribute in a meaningful way in science, but I can tell you that there are also several European projects where Italy is partnered, together with, of course, Arctic countries and other countries, but everyone has the wish, really, to contribute to better understand, to preserve and protect this place.
Thank you. Please, sir.
Hi, I'm the director of the Institute of Future Innovation Studies here at John Cabot University. My name is Francesco Lapenta. I consider myself half Danish. My wife is Danish, and I've been a professor in Denmark for over a decade. And so when the debate about Greenland emerged and Washington started to talk about annexion, there was this sense of outrage about the very discourse. But also speculation, what does it mean when Washington says we need Greenland because of national security? Now, the real reason, in my view, is purely technological and a matter of geometry. It's positioned in a very specific part of the world, where basically means that Russia and China are in the closest possible distance to deploy nuclear weapons. So there's been an observatory in Greenland for some time now, in the space station. But this is becoming increasingly more complex because Russia's developed weapons that can travel incredibly fast and reach places in 4 minutes. And the US is articulating this idea of national defense. And in my view, it all comes down to the Golden Dome. The Golden Dome is this project that's been going on since the Reagan era. It's basically a super advanced kind of station for detection, early detection of missiles. And in my view, the conversation about the Golden Dome is part of the reason why Washington talks of national security. Because in the very moment in which you start to think about that level of technology and how that technology is changing, especially because there's no treaty now, and they clearly knew there was no treaty, and they clearly knew that they wouldn't have a new treaty because China was not included in that treaty. So in your view, how do you perceive the discourse that is going to come back again in different formulas, because it's not going to go away? It's been there for a while. So how is Greenland getting ready to that conversation? What about the position of Greenland about the Golden Dome? What can be done to mitigate that pressure? And what do you think Washington means when they talk of they need it for national security? Is just that, or what is the discourse behind that very cryptic sentence?
Well, let me tell you. No, I don't have all the answers, but and there are much more knowledgeable people here in terms of the current negotiations. I do not have insights to the current negotiations, but I'm taking note that there are negotiations ongoing between Galactic-Nunat, Denmark, and the US. I see the Danish media portray often these negotiations as being the negotiations on the future of Greenland. I think that is a bit, my sense is that that is a bit over-dramatized. I think that the interest of the US is the same as it was at the beginning of the Cold War. It is the same as it was in the 1860s when the US mapped all the resources in Galactic-Nunat and Iceland and had a discussion internally in the State Department about possibly annexing Greenland. I think it's the same as the interests that sparked supposedly the first mentioning by a US president the idea of purchasing or taking over Greenland in the 1830s. So I think there's a constant in the interest of the US in our land and territory and resources. And I also think it's important to remember that politicians in Galactic-Nunat Greenland have been cognizant of that interest for a long time. The Rumsfeld report in the end of the 1990s laid it out very clearly, exactly as you say, that there are a number of rogue states whose interests affect the US, and therefore there's a need to ramp up what was also called the ballistic missile early warning system, which was very clearly also placed in Galactic-Nunat. I grew up just north, part of my childhood, just north of the Arctic Circle. I could see the smoke from the Dai 1 station when the US left the station in the beginning of the 90s. We took a bike ride up one year. That has now become a tradition to do every year for a number of people in Sisimiut, which is the town I'm talking about, to see that area. I remember that when we took that trip in the 90s, my indignation, first of all, because I saw a lot of reindeer tracks, and the biologists had said that there was no reindeer, and I had just started reindeer hunting. That I was that age, and it became very sort of limited how much reindeer we can hunt in those years. But also the indignation of seeing what has been left by the US military in the nature of Qaqqatoqaq. where Taiwan was situated. So this whole distant early warning system that was, situated all the way along the coast of Guarini. So I think for our consciousness as citizens of a nation that has clearly played a very important role for US homeland security, it's not a new thing. On the contrary, there's been a push by Greenland to have the US more clearly recognize the role of Greenland for US homeland security, because if we look back at the defense agreement, they've been titled for the defense of Greenland, when in fact US military presence has been just as much, if not more, caused by their own homeland security. So there's been development in this, and we've seen after 2004, when the government of Greenland negotiated first with Denmark, a seat at the table in this relationship with the US, making it a trilateral relationship. Some years of disappointment from politicians in Guarini that the US presence and the promise from the 2004 agreement, the Igaliku agreement, did not materialize in something more. And so there's been a sort of a natural process of increasingly engaging and more directly with the US, demanding some kind of tangible results benefiting Greenland from US military presence, knowing the significance of the US military presence to US homeland security. So this is not at all new. I think what the world often misses is that agency, that political will, is a political will of Greenland. It is not Denmark and the US. It is Greenland who has asserted its rights, sat down at the table, demanded a say in these relationships. And that is what is changing the dynamics right now compared to how it looked in the 1800s or at the end of the Cold War, or even in 1941 when the first defense agreement was signed. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that it's important to remember that Greenland is doing its negotiations with the US with open eyes and open ears, knowing its history and its own significance to US homeland security, and thereby also to not only the whole Western alliance, but to a broader global development. And I think that is something that weighs heavily on politicians, I'm sure, both in Guarini and in Denmark and in the US, hopefully. What I do want to say is that I can't be worried about the speed of things. Because if we look at the Arctic, and I'm looking here because he knows more about that than I do, I think, but if we look at the Arctic and the presence of NATO, NATO already has a presence if you look at northern Norway and down through Guyuk Gap, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. And you look at the North American presence with NORAD, NORAD already has a role. So with the speed of things right now, also being the attention being turned to NATO presence, I can be concerned if we as leaders of the Arctic, indigenous leaders, nation leaders, state leaders, all other leaders who are involved in NATO, are carefully enough considering what exact role is NATO going to have in the Arctic. How do we ensure that whatever is done in terms of presence, military presence in the Arctic, is not going to do what Lassi said and ended up with a boom? How are we going to ensure that if we are not spending the time considering exactly the details in NORAD, NATO, Greenland, what exactly do we want this defense infrastructure to look like? That is my concern. More than it's a concern to me exactly how Greenland deals with the US, because Greenland have been dealing with the US for a long time.
Thank you, Sarah. I'd like to ask Lassi to also comment on this question.
Yeah, thank you. From my point of view, as a political scientist doing research on security, military security, actually I started to look nuclear weapon systems in 1980s and arms control disarmament. And in the end of the Cold War, second half of 1980s, I mean, the Arctic, or should I say the northernmost parts of the Atlantic Ocean, were very dangerous because there were so-called maritime strategies of the USA and the Soviet Union. And yeah, there was some reason to be a little bit concerned that if it will be escalated. It didn't, other way, very much, because then the presidents of the USA and the Soviet Union made a deal. And in a way, why it was the Minister of the Environment of the Soviet Union who signed the first ever document of 8 Arctic states, 1991. It was still Cold War. And that was simply because these major nuclear weapon states agreed that yes, okay, we have a balance, we cannot break it technologically, and let's keep it stable. And like I said earlier, it's for the global deterrence. Yeah. So I think that to have Greenland, I mean, from the US point of view, to have Greenland because of national security, it's a smoke screen. It's not a real, I mean, experts have been struggling with that, come on, I mean, USA controls Greenland militarily already now and have done that, like Sara said. No need more. and I mean, Golden Dome, etc., but all the experts in the USA on nuclear weapons, they know that no, you cannot build that kind of system which can stop the missiles coming from Russia if there is a real situation. And China is not militarily present in the Arctic, not at all. You have not had Chinese vessels around Greenland within the last 10 years or so. It's total nonsense. And Russia, I mean, well, they have nuclear submarines. They can go wherever they would like to go if there is a need. But that is not, these waters are not the most strategic ones for the Russian submarines. They are more in the Arctic Ocean where you have real deep waters where you can hide. Because that is the mission for a strategic ballistic nuclear submarine, is to hide. Because of the second strike, the so-called revenge strike. And I mean, even USA would have Greenland, it wouldn't help that. Because then that fact it would be there in any case. And USA have technologically tried to find a way how to eliminate the capability for the second strike, but not yet. Because I'm not sure if it is even possible. Because then there is still a chance that more than 1 or 2 missiles will come true. And that is too big risk. They don't take that. So there are some other reasons why USA should have Greenland or own. Isn't that the issue? It's to own. It's about ownership. And I don't really understand why it is so important if they will have an access, because I have understood nowadays ownership is not the issue. It's an access. If you have an access into resources, that's the point. And you can have access without ownership. And of course there are strategic minerals. Of course they are a very important asset for the USA and US companies as well. And should I say first of all. But I agree with Sara. I don't think that USA will do, even Trump administration will do more. And I will stop by your question. Why hasn't Trump used force to acquire Greenland yet? They have used force in Venezuela and now in Iran. Why not Greenland? Because it came earlier even there on the list. Why not? No, because they know that they cannot do that. There are several reasons they cannot do that simply. And they will not do that.
Thank you, Lassi. There's a question all the way at the back. Yep.
Hello, my name is Stefano Valentino. I'm a journalist. I'm a freelance. I contribute to different media outlets in Europe, and I'm a specialist of geopolitics on natural resources and climate change. So I have a quite provoking question, summarizing all the inspiring thoughts that you expressed so far. In my opinion, I think that the struggle over Greenland for natural resources is shared between Europe and US. It's not only the US which is rushing to resources in Greenland. Europe wants to do the same. I read that raw materials need for Europe relies actually on extractive industry in Greenland. So I think on one hand, you have the US and Europe which are rushing to hold their grip on extractive industry in Greenland to supply the industry of Europe and the US with those precisely raw materials which are going to fuel and they're going to power the industrial activities which are contributing to climate change and ultimately to the, let's say, the ravage of Greenland ecosystems. On the other side, you have the scientists which are sending warning, and they try actually to convince the policymakers to protect the fragile ecosystem of the Arctic. This struggle, I think, is also present inside the communities, indigenous communities in Greenland. I attended many conferences about Arctic issues, and I know that sometimes indigenous, they don't speak with one voice. You have some indigenous which actually want to have more industrial development in Greenland. Some of them, they are opposing it. So I think it's much more complicated than what sometimes is debated. So I would like to know exactly how the indigenous people, they can find a way to have their self-determination in a context where there are two polarized concerns which are colliding, preservation of Greenland and economic development, which actually is going to turn back to Greenland as a boomerang effect through global warming, how the indigenous people can make their mind in such a complicated context.
Sarah. And may I just say, Madam Minister, if at any point you wish to speak, please let us know. Sarah, over to you.
Well, if I understood the question correct, in regards to putting it up as a polarized issue, whether we want to develop and utilize our own resources or not. Yes, I don't speak on behalf of the government, but I can give you my analysis, if you so speak. I don't consider it very polarized as such. We have seen, first of all, Inuit, the Greenlandic people, are quite good tradespeople. It's one of the reasons why as an indigenous people of the Arctic, we have not only survived but thrived in the Arctic, and for centuries and centuries, Inuit have met other peoples and traded. The whalers, probably the Italians that came, and so many others. You can look at our national attire, the women's national attire, and see that every single piece that is not a piece of sealskin is a craft taken from another people, from a European people or someone who came in with beads, with other kinds of craft, fabric, not knitting but crocheting and so forth. So I'm just mentioning this, giving you a sense of how many centuries we as a people of the Arctic have already been interacting and trading with other peoples. It's not a new thing. The difference is that, let's say, 100 years ago, when the cryolite was mined in Greenland, it did not benefit the people of Greenland. It benefited the Danes during the Second World War. It benefited the US and the Western Alliance because cryolite was used to produced aluminum, which was used for producing the planes that made it possible for the Western Alliance to win the Second World War. When Greenland obtained home rule, one of the first legislative areas that Greenland took over was controlling the fisheries, controlling the resource. That was in 1979. Fisheries became a control of the people of Greenland in 1980. In 2009, when a big majority, I would say a consensus vote referendum on the self-government agreement, laying out the path that Greenland is on today, took place, the first legislative area that Greenland took over was controlling the mineral resources. Exactly because we've seen centuries of resources being taken without benefiting the people. So we've known as a people that we need to control the resources to counter centuries of colonialism and centuries of extractionism in terms of both the living and non-living resources being utilized, taken, extracted by other peoples. So to me, it's not a polarization. It is a natural part of asserting self-determination and figuring out your way, being the people that you are, to build your economy, saying no to some things, saying yes to some things, determining yourself, and that is the key in this, self-determining what to mine and what not to mine, how to utilize the fisheries resources and what to be careful of. This is all about sovereignty. Fisheries politics is all about sovereignty. It is about self-determining where to live, how to use the resource, how to manage it so that families can live from day to day, especially the coastal fisheries, but also the offshore fisheries, in terms of making sure that there are jobs for the people. So these are really difficult questions that Greenland has dealt with on a governmental level for decades, and long before that, but there's been a while where others from the outside was extracting all of that out of the nation. And so therefore there is a very, very clear legislation today on fisheries as well as on mineral resources. And I think that if I was the government of Greenland, I would ask anyone to abide by the rules and laws of Greenland in engaging with Greenland in terms of mineral and other kinds of resource development. And that is my understanding is what is actually exactly is being done. The door has been open to the EU, to the US, to many more other entities and states in the world to do trade on the mineral resources and invest if they so wish. The reality is that in the Arctic, it is very cost expensive to invest and establish mines especially and large-scale industrial projects. So things have not been happening as fast as some might have thought it would since self-government was inaugurated in 2009 when it comes to the mineral and large-scale business and industrial development. But the legislation is there, and it's self-determined by the people of Greenland through the People's Parliament and the government of Greenland. So that's the key thing for us. And I don't see a polarization. I know that there are 1 or 2 or 3, maybe 5 voices that want to polarize, but I literally do not see a polarized people. On the contrary, I see a people that is standing unified, backing up our government, backing up our parliament. And this is all the parties and the vast, vast majority of the people of Greenland.
Thank you, Sarah. I believe there's a question there, yes? Yeah.
Okay. A question for Professor Juliana. Now that with the climate change and all the technological development, do you see a problem with the dual use of equipment in the Arctic that can be, scientific use, military use? It used to be no problem, you just had dog sleds, but now you have heavy-duty equipment. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I can give you my personal experience. As I said, I lived in Norway for quite a while, and then we have very often asked, for example, the Coast Guard to help us collecting data, for example, right, in Norway. And in Italy, well, Ministry of Defense is already supporting the science we do in Antarctica, providing logistics. And maybe in the future, they will support logistics also in other parts of the world. Until the data are open and used for science, well, we might want to do it or wish to do it. There are some countries where, for example, the Ministry of Defense has always supported polar science and also other type of science, but now we are talking about the Arctic, so polar science, for example, UK, many other countries. I mean, for them, that was the only options, for example, to go to Antarctica or to do science in the Arctic. I think that the data collected by scientists should be kept open. This is what I'm thinking, and for science. And they should be, as we mentioned, interoperable, so they should be used by others. So this is my, let's say, comment. Yeah, I think the data should be kept open.
Thank you. Yes, there's a question here. Yeah.
Hi. I want to thank you all for taking the time to come speak to us tonight. My name is Hunter, and I'm an undergraduate in international affairs here at John Cabot. And I guess I would address this question openly to the panel and to no one in specific, but I'm really curious, something that has come to my mind hearing about these themes of like self-determination and about the Arctic Council as an Arctic community. What is the significance of the many observers to the Arctic Council? Like Italy is hosting as an observer this forum, and something that's come up in research that I've done is a lot of debate about the nature of like China's involvement in the Arctic Council. And I'm very curious about how important these observers are in the Arctic Council and what it means to be an observer or perhaps a near Arctic power, which is a term that I've heard a couple times. Thank you.
So I'll ask each of you to respond briefly because there are still a lot of questions in the room. Let's start with Lassi and move downwards.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Again, I mean, there are several observers, first from European states. But then 2013 was Big Bang, when the Arctic states accepted and indigenous peoples as permanent participants of the Arctic Council accepted 5 from Asia. And there was imbalance, only from Europe earlier and then from Asia. And then China came in. China, South Korea, Japan, India, Singapore. And that was simply because then the Arctic states, they realized that they cannot stop that because there is interest. But actually, the interesting thing is that like China was invited to attend the International Polari Year, 2006. And they said, okay, we will come and start research there. And so this is very natural because the Arctic is global. Arctic has been global for long. It's nothing new, actually. So to do research. But of course, like I said, pollution, long-range pollution was first there, and then climate change. But at that time, it was not yet climate change. So that is not the reason in the first place. But then, of course, more and more because of that. And why India? India was very surprised that, oh, we just applied and now you accept us. Well, because they wanted to take all from Asia. Like I had heard already a bit earlier from India, why India is interested in? Because it's so important for Indian monsoon. Indian monsoon the Arctic climate determines Indian monsoon. So that simple is that. Why to be interested in and why to do research there?
Thank you. I think that to fully understand maybe the whole structure of the Arctic Council, it's important to reiterate that the uniqueness of the Arctic Council is not that it's an intergovernmental organization with 8 states. It is unique in itself that it has exactly those 8 states at the table, but that it in itself doesn't make it as unique as it does, as the fact that indigenous peoples are at the table makes it unique. The 6 permanent participants are part of the consensus in the Arctic Council. So when decisions are taken in the Arctic Council, they are taken with the 6 permanent participants. And we've seen case after case where this has been exercised, where this has been the case, that states are waiting for the permanent participants to actually take part in the decision for the decision to be valid. So that is, to me, what makes the Arctic Council so unique, that it has states and indigenous peoples at the table, creating the system of a consensus-based decision-making, which includes not only the states, but also the indigenous peoples. We cannot have an Arctic Council, and I will not talk about near-Arctic states, I will talk about Arctic states and non-Arctic states. We cannot have an Arctic Council where non-Arctic states have a decision-making power in the Arctic Council. That, I think, is an extremely important sort of guardrail to maintain. We have to have an Arctic Council that is for and by the Arctic peoples, indigenous peoples, nations, and governments, states. Governments that are also non-states are actually now, for example, the government of Greenland, leading the work of the Arctic Council. It has in itself a challenge in the sense that it has not always been so. Last time the Swedes had the chairship of the Arctic Council, they took away Greenland from the signs and made it to Kingdom of Denmark. They took out the flag of Greenland from the room, resulting in Greenland at that time in 2013 boycotting the Arctic Council. And that created a serious situation, not just for Greenland, but for the Arctic Council in terms of maintaining its legitimacy as a council that is for and by Arctic peoples themselves. So I think the structure of the Arctic Council is really, really important to safeguard and not sort of water down by including others in the decision-making that are non-Arctic states, peoples, nations. So when that is said, the observers are necessary to ensure that they are fully informed, they understand the rationales, they understand the reasoning, they understand our governance systems in whatever we decide about the Arctic. And this exact same mechanism we see in the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. Here there was a clear recognition by Arctic littoral states and indigenous peoples, the Inuit Circumpolare Council took part in this, in that there was a need to invite non-Arctic states to be part of that treaty, recognizing that certain states, including China, have an interest in the fisheries resources or the possible future fisheries resources in the Central Arctic Ocean, but more importantly, that we as Arctic states and peoples have an interest in leading the governance of the Central Arctic Ocean in terms of the fisheries. So if that governance is to be successful in terms of also governing how China behaves in the Central Arctic Ocean, there was a need for the treaty, and there was a need for those states, including the non-Arctic states that are part of the treaty, to be in the same room. So that is, to me, quite different from the Arctic Council's work. There are 2 things that the Arctic Council from the outset have not done. One is military security, the other is high-level fisheries politics. And there's a reason for that. And that's also part of the reason that the Arctic Council is actually successful, because it's been able to continue working on those matters that all 8 states and 6 permanent participants can agree on. But we need to keep the observers fully informed at the table in the format of being observers, listening to the governance and policies that we make as Arctic inhabitants, and work closely in partnership with observers to uphold that room of cooperation. And so the observers are under review every other year. There's a rotation in that. And my recommendation is for the observers to be very aware of what are the needs of the indigenous peoples, what are the needs of the states, what directions are we taking, and where can the observers actually contribute to strengthening the work of the Arctic Council. There's an endless list of opportunities, but it only will be successful if it's done with the full recognition of the leadership of the Arctic states and indigenous peoples.
Yeah, I can say a couple of words about an observer, not an Arctic state. And since 2013, Italy is an observer in the Arctic Council. And then we have a special envoy for the Arctic at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is Ambassador Pinna, and he's participating in the meeting that you have. He cannot, of course, speak during the work, but he can speak during the coffee break and lunches, yes. And then there has been also the establishment of this tavolo artico, so it's a sort of Arctic table translated, where, is led by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so Ambassador Pinna, and then we have quite very, very often meetings, and in these meetings, I think many people, I see also many people here in the audience invited. There are research institute, universities, different organizations, different ministers invited to participate and to listen what is discussed, because then Ambassador Pin is bringing back what is discussed during the Arctic Council. As an observer, we participate through the working group. This is what we can do. We participate there. We give our contribute in this working group. 8 working group on different topics. So this is where we can provide, for example, knowledge. We contribute in the discussion, also in framing a little bit the scientific dialogue, and we provide the data, because Italy is, and mostly, at the Institute of Polar Science at CNR, we keep 2 databases open, where we basically collect all the data that Italy is collecting in the Arctic and also in Antarctica. So this is the contribute. This is the way in which we act in the Arctic Council.
Fantastic, thank you. Yes, please, Federico.
Thank you, Doa. Thank you to the panelists. I was wondering, is anybody here from the Canadian Embassy, any chance? No. Too bad. They received an invitation, and I was precisely wondering, what is the role of Canada in regards to, for example, defending the sovereignty of Greenland and of Denmark at the same time, and sort of defending them as they do, the Canadian Prime Minister, for example, from a certain aggressiveness on the side of the US administration. What is your point of view in regards to the role of this large country, which is your neighbor? Your real neighbor is Canada, not the United States, in all honesty. And by the way, if I may, I would like to specify that John Cabot, Giovanni Cabot, was born in Gaeta, not in Genova.
Sorry,
yes,
not in Genova.
yes, yes.
It's true, in Gaeta.
Exactly, which is, for those who are unacquainted, a town midway between Rome and Naples. Then he went to Venice, but then the Venetians were interested in the Adriatic. He was not. So he went to England and became the, quote, Columbus of the United Kingdom, which was not united yet. Thank you. Please.
Yes, so for the Inuit Circumpolare Council, Canada and parts of Canada is included in the Inuit homelands, or Inuit Nunat, as we say. So Inuit, the indigenous people called Inuit, live in Greenland, Canada, Alaska, and Chukotka, Russia. And for us, therefore, our homelands span 4 very different nation states. We have upheld our cooperation in these difficult times. Also, after 2022, we include our Russian members in our work, and it's only online. We don't meet with them in person currently, and that is their own decision. The door from our side is open for them to be there in person. We will have our General Assembly in the summer in Iqaluit, Nunavut, Canada, and ICC Canada will take over. Our chairship also rotates every 4 years, so it will go from Greenland to Canada in the Inuit Circumpolare Council. Our organization was established during the Cold War, and already at the first meeting in 1977, Inuit from Alaska, Canada, and Greenland called on the then Soviet Union to ensure that it's possible for Inuit in Chukotka to be part of the Inuit Circumpolare Conference, as it was called back then. Now it's called the Council, Inuit Circumpolare Council. So for us, Canada, the US, and Chukotka are part of our homelands in that sense. Of course, we know that there's international borders that is sort of dividing our homelands, but they are all, I go to Alaska and Inupiat speak the same language as me. Inuit Yupik from Alaska go to Chukotka in Russia and they speak the same language, the same dialect, which is a bit more difficult for me to understand, but still our Inuit language. And the same for Inuit in Canada. So, again, not speaking on behalf of the government of Greenland, but I think it was extremely positive to see the new consulate of Canada opening in Nuuk a few weeks ago. I know that it was our fellow Inuit in Canada who contributed to that part of the Canadian strategy, calling for Canada and having it established as a policy in the Canadian strategy to have consulates in other places in Inuit Nunat, so Nuuk as well as Anchorage in the US. And so we saw a plane full of Inuit leaders and fellow Inuit coming over from Canada with Air Inuit at the opening of the consulate. And for us, there was this duality to it. On one hand, the ministerial gathering of the foreign minister, of course, of Galashiq Nunat and the foreign minister of Canada, but also the people-to-people ties being made stronger. For Inuit to now also have consulates in our homelands to directly engage, directly expand our cooperation. Our cooperation that in many ways, with the militarization, but also the colonization, have, become full of barriers. For example, in terms of trade, in terms of traveling, mobility, and so forth. So for us, as Inuit, it really is a sort of a symbol of great hope that we now have a Canadian consulate in Nuuk. At the same time, of course, there's a significance to it because Canada has been so clear in its support to Galashiq Nunat and also clear in terms of where Canada stands in regarding the changing world order. So, of course, that is also part of the whole situation. But I do want to make it very clear that Inuit live across 4 very, very different nation states, and it's been a precondition for us, the great power rivalry and the great power sort of prospects or possibilities of it not always being easy. And even in easier times, that's something that Inuit leaders were very aware of. And I think that's why it's important to also remember how indigenous peoples of the Arctic have often paved the way for the governments to engage. And that's often forgotten when we talk about the political history of the Arctic.
Lassi, would you like to comment on Canada?
Yeah, thank you. In addition what Sara said, I would say that Canada has played and plays very important role in Arctic research. And I can say this because one of my academic affiliations is to be adjunct professor at Trent University, one of the leading Canadian universities dealing with Arctic and indigenous studies. And I have cooperated with Canadians for decades. And I have to say that Canada is exactly that, who first started to speak for circumpolar North cooperation. I mean, in addition of indigenous peoples, but here I mean in Arctic research. And if we think about Arctic cooperation, and one of the reasons why it is so resilient is that actually the core is the Nordic region. The cooperation between the 3 Nordic countries and 5 Nordic countries and 3 autonomous regions, including Greenland. And so there was already this kind of cooperation with devolution, including self-determination for indigenous people. So, and then it was very natural for the Nordic countries, Canada. Oh, okay. That is almost like one of the Nordic countries. Do the Canadians agree on that or not? I'm looking one of my Canadian colleagues there. But however, Canada was acting very much supporting this kind of circumpolar cooperation. And Canada was one of those first ones who made an agreement on science with the Soviet Union already in 1970s. And so on. And I mean, Canada has been for me always that, okay, yes, Canada is for multilateral cooperation. Canada is for Arctic cooperation. And absolutely now Canada has acted so differently comparing its southern neighbor. And I trust that Canada will continue on this track.
Thank you, Lassi. There's only time for one last question, and there's a gentleman in the back who's been waiting patiently.
Hi. Thank you to the panelists. I'm not an expert on the Arctic Council, so please correct me if I wrongly characterize. But I'd like to hear you.
Why don't you move forward so
Yes,
we can hear
okay.
you better?
I would be interested in your opinion on the structure of the Arctic Council. It seems to me that due to the consensus-based structure, there is an impasse often, particularly on climate issues. And it seems to me that this has shifted the power dynamics within the Arctic Council into perhaps a more obscure technocracy driven within the working groups, and whether, first of all, is this characterization remotely correct? But do you foresee that this, in a way, will come to affect national priorities or national impacts from the Arctic Council in the future?
Okay, I think I'd like each of the panelists to respond very quickly to this. Lassi, do you want to start and then we move down?
Thank you for the question. It's interesting that Arctic Council has raised some interest, and I'm not talking about only very recently, I mean a bit earlier, like I said, why there are 9 of the 10 biggest economies, why they are either Arctic states or observer states of the Arctic Council. There are some reasons. So Arctic Council has become very popular. But I mean, one reason is that it is very innovative structure when it was established. And that is exactly what Sara mentioned earlier, that there are not only Arctic states, but also indigenous people's organizations as permanent participants. And I mean, but it's not an international organization. It's high-level forum. And that is very much behind there that it has been so resilient. And there are a few issues that they don't discuss, simply because it's put. But it's partly also the problem, because then, like what you said, then national policies can lead too much issues and policies dealing with utilization of resources. So Arctic Council is not simply able to make any strict environmental regulations because the Arctic states don't want to have that. But it has been very, very useful, and particularly now for this situation, to be like it is, very flexible structure.
Mm. And before I answer your question, I thought Lassi would mention, but for the previous question on Canada's role, I just wanted to add that, of course, in terms of North American defense infrastructure or structure, Canada and the US are totally intertwined through NORAD. And therefore, I think that, you know, when we talk about North American defense structures and infrastructures, you cannot talk about that without talking about Canada and talking with Canada. So that's a new thing, or that's another thing that we have to keep our eye very closely on in terms of the current, hopefully, the eyes are kept very closely on that in the current negotiations between Greenland, US, and Denmark. To your question, as Lassi said, the Arctic Council is not treaty-based. One reason that we meet in person with Russia in the International Maritime Organization, in the Central Arctic Ocean's Fisheries Agreement, when we talk about UN matters, climate change and so forth, is because those frameworks are treaty-based. Politicians within Kingdom of Denmark, in Norway, in Iceland, they don't, as such, have to be questioned, why do you sit at the table with Russia when they go to IMO, when they go to the meetings of the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. That's why I'm bringing these examples up, because there we meet in person. The reason why we don't meet in person in the Arctic Council is exactly because it's not treaty-based. It requires the political will of every state and indigenous peoples organization to continue engaging in the room we call the Arctic Council. Because we are not bound to do so, because it's not treaty-based. And so that's why it's been so challenging since 2022. And the 7 states, when they decided to pause their participation in the Arctic Council, they did not include the permanent participants in that decision. And permanent participants were quite baffled, I can tell you. And permanent participants all called for states to find a way to continue engaging in the Arctic Council. And slowly the restart happened with the transition of the chairship from Russia to Norway. And Norway found ways, modalities to do that in. And now the Kingdom of Denmark is continuing that path. So with that, it's extremely important to remember why it is important that it's consensus-based. If it is not consensus-based, it will no longer exist. It's as simple as that. So that was my reply.
Well, I can say what I said at the beginning. I mean, science is based on government, let's say, decision or position, because we can collaborate with the countries if there are, for example, funding to do so, if the visa of some scientist is allowed. So this we can do. So science, it is definitely affected by government. And when it comes to Arctic Council, this has been said, this is the place where we sit together. And when we can talk about, where we can talk about science in the different working groups. So I think that this kind of arena, these kind of places need to be kept alive, because this is where we can discuss about science. Because if then the narrative is going towards, as we have said, geopolitics and also these sort of things, that we lose the attention on issues that will affect everyone, like sea level rise, for example, or the increase of extreme events. And so we need to be a bit careful there, because this is something that is happening and is affecting all countries. So also the narrative should be slightly be more towards these issues instead.
Thank you. So this brings us to the end. You will have heard Sara throughout the evening refer to Greenland as Kalalit Lunat. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. And that is because that is the name of Greenland in Inuit. That word means the land of the Inuit people. That is how Greenland is called. And the last time I met Sara, we were in Nuuk. It was the Polar Law Symposium. And I won't forget how she took me to the window of the conference and she said, "Do you see that little blue house?" And it was all surrounded by ice. And she said, "That's my house." And Sara, I have thought a lot about your little blue house in the middle of all this storm of Greenland in the news, because people are right at the center of this. There are the Inuit people who live in Greenland, who consider Greenland their homeland. It is their story, it is their history, it is their memories, and there is that little blue house that I would ask you also to keep in your minds as you think of Greenland. I'd like to thank you all in Greenlandic, Kuyanak. Minister, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence, and thank you to an incredible panel that has been so patient and has answered hundreds of questions. And finally, thank you to Enrico Fardella of the Guarini Institute, who was the engine behind this event. And thank you, of course, to John Cabot. And Mr. President, thank you for coming and for your opening remarks. Goodbye, and to the panelists, don't go away. There are press interviews.
My voice is gone now. No?
One additional point. Enrico Fardella took the lion's share in organizing this event, but unfortunately an evil virus got him, so he had to stay home with fever, but we think of him fondly. And I would like also to add congratulations to our formidable Guarini Institute team, particularly student intern Chloe and magic employee Mus, and of course our blessed Azelia. Thank you so much.